Well, we've got a very special Wednesday walkabout for you today. It's on the topic of container gardening, or more specifically, container landscaping. This is a concept that was actually coined by one of the gardeners in Ireland at Ardennes, Nuala, forgive me if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, and she started out that tour talking about container landscaping. So today we're going to discuss what it is it practical, is it possible, and is it something that you might want to incorporate into your gardening this fall? Now, in between each one of these points, I'm going to show you lots and lots of images and examples of container landscaping. We're going to try to put them on the screen slowly enough so that if you want to take a screenshot of it, if you want to take notes, if you want to record some of the formula in your garden journal, you can do that. But I hope you really enjoy them. I want to give a big shout out because a lot of them are from Klaus Dalby and a lot of them are images that I took when I was at Ardennes. Some of them might be images in my own garden. I have yet to really pull them all together for you to take a look at, but really enjoy them. Take the time to deconstruct them and just kind of think how, based on your own garden fit, what your budget is, where you live, what times of the year you want to really put on this kind of drama. Take into account good garden fit and just look at through that lens as you examine each one of these examples. And by the way, at the end, you might want to stay tuned because I'm going to show you a few more updates to my potting area in one of my long forgotten spaces. Well, we all know what container gardening is. It's just gardening in a container where we grow plants within containers that we have strategically placed around our gardens. But what is container landscaping? Well, probably the best example of that, and we can show some pictures right here, is a very, very popular practice of Klaus Dalby, and that is where you aggregate a very, very coordinated collection of container gardens on typically kind of like a terraced slope or with some gradation to them on varying levels. And they're very highly color coordinated. They are very thought out. And the end result is basically a small landscape that you are creating entirely composed of different containers. So what we're going to discuss today is it practical? Number one, is it too expensive? Is it going to make our gardens look cluttered? Is it too fleeting? Is it too short-lived? Is it too labor intensive because it requires lots of grooming, it requires lots of watering and lots of attention? And is it even practical given the extremes in which those of us in the States garden, on the high end of the temperature spectrum or on the low end? But it is definitely dramatic, it's definitely impactful, and it's definitely very, very popular. And when you look at these images, you'll see why. Now, whether we know it or not, most of us have already created small container landscapes. Every time we put together an aggregation of pots, a collection of pots, say on our front steps, like my white congregation of pots on my front steps, or an area where we have by the patio, or at any kind of punctuation point in our garden at the end of a walkway. And we have a number of different container plantings that we have strategically cultivated and curated to look good together, that is a mini landscape. But we typically are doing it on a modest level. The container landscapes that we're talking about here are far grander than that. They are taking that small congregation of plants and really exponentially expanding them to include all sorts of different colors, different textures, but very, very much with intentionality in mind. Now, the first person that I saw that did this, I think, well, actually, I've seen a number of people do that. I just didn't know to identify it as such. But who does it better than anyone, I think, is, of course, Klaus Dalby. And there's all sorts of images, Stuart. We can show some here. Obviously, if you get his book, Container Gardening, there's all sorts of examples in container gardening, and that he will then, from a very specific color point of view, create these container garden landscapes. So what is it about these container garden landscapes that make them special? And I think that we can figure out, a way to maybe translate them into our own gardens if we decide we indeed want to. So let's look at it through that lens. Is it even possible? We'll start out with, I think, what might be a consideration number one. Now let's start out with an example and go point by point, whether or not this is even possible for you or for me. So look at this gorgeous image. This is all really just an orchestration of different colors of pinks and grays. It's a very tight color palette. And if you count, well, my goodness, there's just, I don't know how many different containers in this container landscape. So I think that brings about question number one. Is it feasible? Because it might be so expensive. And there is a lot of expense associated with really grand container landscapes like this one. Number one, you want to make sure that all of the pots relate to one another. And if you're like me and the containers are in a material like antique clay or concrete or something with heft and formidability, those ain't cheap. So you have to take into account the cost of the containers themselves and whether or not it's practical because, well, you might live in an area that gets very, very hard frosts and that might damage those containers over time. Do you have storage capacity for those containers when they're not in use? And then obviously there is, the expense of just getting them in the first place. Now we can mitigate that by going to thrift stores, by going to estate sales, by taking hand-me-downs from others, by looking for really good deals, and perhaps by taking inexpensive pots and aging them ourselves. But nevertheless, it does require a lot of energy to collect all of those so they speak in the same consonant tone. Because one of the keys to these kinds of container landscapes is that every one thing in the composition relates to every other thing. And in this case, all of the containers speak to one another and are members, if you will, of the same family. I want to remind you that we're going to have a Linda Vodder Live coming up on August 31st. That's a Sunday at 2 p.m. Central Standard Time. I hope you will start thinking about what questions you have for me, what comments you have related to some of the projects we've been working on in the past, and just join us because it's always fun and we have a good laugh. Plus, it will be probably, well, I'm going to guess, the last Linda Vodder Live I do before I become a grandmother. So I hope you can join us. Okay, secondly, in addition to the expense of the pots, there's the expense of the plants themselves. Not only the expense, but our ability to find them if we are trying to replicate a look like this. Now, obviously, we can take hand-me-downs from others. We can divide our own plants. We can shop our own gardens for things to get the look that we want. We can go to plant sales at the end of the season. And we can, of course, propagate our own by seed or by starts. But the expense of the plants is also a consideration. How do we mitigate that problem? Well, by the aforementioned ideas, but also by perhaps not being so rigid in trying to create a look like the one I just showed you or in some of the images here. We have to put perhaps an Oklahoma or a geographical accent on whatever it is we can grow. So if you can't grow dahlias, then you might look at something like a zinnia or a doppelganger to create that look. We just can't be too just too rigid in the way that we look at the different kinds of plants that can create an effect. Which plants can we grow from seed? Which ones can we nab from our neighbors? And which ones can we just find in our own gardens just by dividing them? So that can be attended to the expense of the plant themselves, but it does require energy and it does require lots of curation and research. Well, another real concern is the question, is it too short term for all of the labor, the resources, and the attention to detail that it requires? Because unlike in Ireland, here in the States, our temperatures can fluctuate so extremely and our weather conditions can be equally as extreme. So is it worth it to put together a really elaborate container landscaping when the plants in the said containers aren't going to last very long? Because tulips might last for a long time in a container in another part of the world, but here in our climate, not so much. The other kinds of plants that are here just for a short amount of time are what I think of as late spring or early summer annuals. They may look great for a period of time, but they're not going to last the duration of the summer. They're only here for a fleeting moment. So is it worth it given the short duration that we can enjoy them? Well, with all of this dedication, let's just say it requires a lot of labor. You have to select your pots, you have to move them around, you have to water them a lot, you have to groom them. They're very, very labor intensive in addition to the expense and all of the geographical considerations as to their, well, so you can just get them to stay looking good. Because otherwise, and this is maybe the fourth reason that it may not be possible, it can look like a cluttered mess. Because it's one thing if you have very, very benevolent conditions and all that you've created lasts for a long period of time and lasts in a good looking state. If it doesn't, if suddenly it gets very, very hot or very, very windy in one short afternoon, all of your work can just, well, it can be destroyed. So that's another consideration too. Is it worth all of the effort and the time? And is it right for you, especially if you are like me and you want something to always look composed and not look cluttered? Because it's one thing if you've got an assembly of pots and they all are great, they're all happy, and their contents are equally as happy, or if on the other hand, it's gotten hot, you've gotten hail, you've gotten tired, and all of those containers look like a jumbled mess. Now, lest you're concerned, we're going to put all this together for you in a screenshot that takes into account all of these considerations so you can determine if a container landscape is right for you. Now, if you go to Ardennes, this fabulous Irish garden that I went to, and we will be showing you more of all of the Ireland gardens that we took on our Garden Gate magazine tour here before too long. But if you went to Ardennes or you went to Klaus Dalby's, pretty much in every season, they would have these fantastic container landscapes, beautifully composed, beautifully tended, and beautifully curated. However, that is not necessarily possible here in Oklahoma, at least in my garden, where it's going to be, I think, 100 or 102 today, and these temperatures are going to persist for a while. I don't want to go to the expense of composing a container landscape, and I certainly don't want to be out there tending them on a hot afternoon. So here are ways that we can make it applicable to the way we like to garden. Number one, do it on a smaller scale. You don't have to have 50 pots. You might have 5 or 7, typically in a smaller number. Number two, it doesn't have to be an ever-present fixture. It can be a seasonal appointment, a seasonal flourish, if you will, that you decide just to do in the spring or in the fall. I might do one kind of container landscape in my front garden in the spring and another kind of container landscape along, say, running up and down my steps in the fall. So you can choose the scale and the size of your container landscape and the timing of your container landscape if it's a look that you crave and you want to recreate. Now, on this little outline for you, we are going to try to delineate out the keys to the look. Well, one of the keys to the look is dimensionality and kind of presenting your plants and displaying them on a grade or on a slope. Now you can do that all on one level by putting taller plants to the back and shorter plants to the front, or you can do what I typically do, and that is really displaying them on some kind of terrace. Now the terrace that I have here, these were from my old QVC line. I will try to find and put some plant terrace options for you in the description box below to some of the different places where you might look for these kinds of metal terraces. But be creative. If they're going to be closely packed together, you could use something as inexpensive as stacked cinder blocks, stacked bricks, old stacked steps. You could even put wooden planks or an old shutter on top of cinder blocks, and then you just pack them together so closely that you don't see any of the mechanics behind it. And so that's a key to the look, is grade, dimensionality, and hiding your uglies. Well, I wouldn't be Linda Vodder if I didn't allude to at least one of my books, and that's The Elegant and Edible Landscape. What is material for these container landscapes? Well, just don't look only within the ornamental world at annuals, at perennials, at blooming shrubs. You want to take into account everything, and that would include what I think of as edimentals. Beautiful deep purple kales, very, very colorful pepper plants, tomato plants, anything that can in a gorgeous way, cue the sprinkler, in a gorgeous way can contribute to your display. It can be edible, it can be ornamental, or it can be a fusion of the both. The other thing that you don't want to overlook is the contribution of shrubs. Now, probably my favorite container landscape is typically when I just put a congregation together of topiaries, of boxwood topiaries, or just boxwood balls, evergreens in general. In fact, you could put together a beautiful winter container landscape using nothing but evergreens and beautiful conifers. Now, I've talked a lot about the downsides and I think the demands of creating a beautiful container landscape. But what are the advantages? Well, number one, there is no better seasonal flourish. There is no better way to express the artistic side of yourself and your inclination to play with different kinds of color palettes at different times of year. Now, in my mind, the most effective container landscapes are those that really are disciplined in their use of color. Lots of color echoes, lots of varying degrees of color intensity, both in flower and in foliage. Interesting textural contrast, and well, just an interesting use of every different kind of facet of the plant worlds. The other advantage is of the plant world. The other advantage is it is movable. So I might want to have a wonderful full container landscape in full sun in the spring, but after that family reunion is over, I can take each of those containers and I can move them to another location where they are happier. The other thing that I can do is, if it's a short-term proposition, and it typically is, then I can take those perennials or those shrubs that were contributing to my container landscape and I can plant them in the beds in the spring or fall. So there is very little waste. It's just repurposing, moving about, or recomposing something that looked one way as a container landscape, but it looks another way when, as I said, the family reunion disperses. Oh, but I do love my pea gravel. I almost can't have enough. So I like to keep a good stash of it here in one of these trash cans so that I can use it to top dress my plants if I need to. But I have two more bags and we are going to finish mulching this area right here and also this space to kind of do a little bit more work here in my potting area. So I'm going to be working on that. A number of you asked where I got this great scoop, and this great scoop belonged to my second mother, and it's just really handy to be right there. It's the perfect quantity of gravel to top dress most of my plants. And here's a couple of other small changes that I've made. This is an ongoing project that I consider to be a project we're all working on, not just me, because you've given me so much good advice. I continue to add more ajuga
to areas along the edge. I have painted this pipe. Stuart, did you even notice? I painted this pipe, and it will continue to get dirtier and grungier, and that is just fine with me. I planted just a little bit of ajuga here to see if I think, first of all, to see if I could even penetrate this soil or if there was some kind of impediment underneath that I couldn't have any kind of ajuga there. But of all of this ajuga that I've planted, even though it is, well, it's pretty hot outside, it nevertheless is doing fine because this is in a shady area, and I think it'll look really great after I finish getting the gravel in place. Another thing that I've been working on is this area along in here, because I don't want it to be too intentional, because for me it really has to be a practical storage area, but I do want it to be attractive and practical. So a couple of observations, comments on some of your questions, and also just my question of the day. This area in here, Stuart, if you want to come over and kind of show people what is inside this gap between the brick wall and the fence, you'll see that it is probably only about 15 inches wide. There's no irrigation back here. The soil is miserable, and I really don't want to do anything in the way of planting. Yes, would it be cool if I lived in ideal conditions to grow something like a climbing hydrangea on here, or a clematis, or any of the other suggestions you gave me? It would be wonderful, but I'm being practical. I don't live in gardening heaven. I live in Oklahoma, and I know that this would just become, Stuart's laughing, that this would just become a muddy maintenance mess. That sums it up pretty nicely. A muddy maintenance mess, and I don't want that additional work. I want it to always look crisp and tailored. But here's my question of the day. I don't want to go to a lot of expense to put down gravel over this, or really even make too many more changes to the walkway itself. However, it would look a lot nicer, I think, if in this area in here, I just put inexpensive gravel. So it doesn't look like it's just a weedy mess, but that it's a little bit more intentional, and it's still an area where I can store my things. It would also work as seed suppression, and I don't have to worry about it going over to my neighbor's, some of it creeping onto the other side of the fence, because she has gravel on the other side of her fence. So it should work out nicely. So that's my question of the day. Do I want to add gravel all up and down the expanse of this fence line to make it look more attractive? Then when we come back, I want to show you a couple of other additions that I've made. Okay, I am making sure that I am keeping this well watered until established. Here is a new gardening tip. When it tells you on the plant tag that a plant is drought tolerant or can handle really bright and sunny conditions, or that is a tough plant, that's true. But typically it's not true until it gets established. That's the key phrase, until it gets established. And in that interim period of time, you really do have to babysit them. Okay, here's the last thing that I wanted to show you. And that is, I so liked the look of this Eugenia topiary here that I thought, oh, well, what this needs is it needs more structural evergreens. And I think it does. And a number of you pointed that out. Here's another tip. If you want any one inexpensive plant that you can probably get right now that will give you for lack of a better word, I don't know, the Linda Vodder look or this kind of structured evergreen look, then you might want to hunt out some Eugenia topiaries. They're pretty easy to find this time of year. A lot of times they go on sale, and even if they go on sale and they're in a less than best condition, I wouldn't hesitate to go ahead and buy them, because they will respond to TLC very, very quickly and very successfully. So give it a lot of water, give it a lot of light, and give it a lot of fertilizer, and it will respond accordingly. So it's a great way to get this kind of instant drama. The other thing that I did was I had a couple of these small-leaved hollies that just weren't doing very well. They did great at first, but then they were on those steps, and I should have moved them sooner than I did because they were just getting way too much sun and way too much heat. So what I've done is I just clipped out, selectively clipped out all of the dead in the interior, and I've put both of them here along my fence line. Now, what I will probably do next season, because I think it would look really good, hide some of the scruffiness and really make this look a lot softer, is I would probably plant some wire vine or some Muhlenbeckia at the base of this, because I really, really like that look. And in fact, Stuart, right here, let's put a picture where it shows what that Muhlenbeckia looks like when it is kind of cascading over the side of an evergreen. I'll still have place for my different garden ornaments and things here, but I think it can be really, really beautiful. And then speaking of a container landscape, I can create maybe a mini very long container landscape here for my garden tour, just by plopping down some seasonal color in pots that are ready to go, that look fresh and that are seasonal. So I hope all of that information is helpful for you today. Look at it again through the lens of, is a container landscape right for you on any size, on any scale, and in any color palette? And if you like this kind of content, then please make sure to give us a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, but more importantly, share with others that might be, really might want to be a part of this very, very supportive circle of gardeners and like-minded friends. So there you go. Enjoy your day, and we will see you this weekend. And if you want some pretty good examples of, well, a version of this kind of container garden landscaping, I encourage you to look at the playlist with my friend John Turman and his outdoor garden spaces, actually even his interior spaces. But he does some of this along the west side of his house, and just has some really, really great compositions that are very strategically curated in terms of color and hue. So after you watch this one, you might want to head over to that playlist, John Turman's Interior and Exterior Spaces.